For our Experts in Emotion interview, we'll be speaking with Dr. Ronald Dahl on emotion and sleep in adolescence. Dr. Dahl is a professor in the School of Public Health and the director of the Institute of Human Development at the University of California, Berkeley. He obtained his MD and fellowship training in sleep and neuroendocrinology at the University of Pittsburgh and completed a pediatric residency at Duke University. At the University of Pittsburgh, he led a program of clinical research at the interface of child psychiatry, pediatrics, and psychology, focusing on the development of sleep and arousal as well as affect regulation and their relevance to behavioral and emotional health in children and adolescents. At UC Berkeley, his current work is now extending these lines of investigation to bridge from developmental, social, and affective neuroscience to address a broader range of clinical, educational, and social policy issues with a primary focus on adolescence. So I now turn to a very special Experts in Emotion interview together with Dr. Ronald Dahl. So welcome, Ron. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
So I thought we could start with me asking you just a little bit about what first got you interested in emotion.
I've had really long-standing and deep interest in emotion and affective dimensions of experience broadly. And I think even going back to my early training in pediatrics, the relevance of how feelings influence real behavior and decision-making was just central to, I think, so much of my experience in trying to target problems. And then the second thing is that early on in my research career, I was focusing on emotion disorders, on depression and anxiety, and that raised a whole set of questions about emotions and how to think about them and emotion regulation, and that interfaced nicely with the sleep and arousal regulation from a developmental perspective. So it's sort of a long-standing interest broadly in affective domains and the role of feelings in the development of young people and their social experiences.
Excellent. So I want to now just ask you a few questions about your work in this domain. So, I mean, your work is so exciting, and you're widely known for this work you've done on the relationship between sleep and emotion, especially among adolescents. And I wonder if you could say just a little bit from your perspective about what do you think are the most exciting discoveries here?
So I think there are a couple things. I want to focus initially on this idea of bidirectional interactions. Mm-hmm. And the evidence has been growing. I think there were a lot of hints for that early on, just from basic observational studies, that emotional arousal can interfere with sleep in a variety of ways, and emotional distress can interfere with sleep. And this idea that sleep is turning off vigilance, so anything that raises arousal and vigilance can interact negatively with sleep. And then the fact that insufficient sleep or disturbed sleep interferes with aspects of emotion regulation sets up this framework for spirals, negative spirals of bidirectional interactions that spiral down. The flip side of that is if one can intervene strategically, particularly in key windows of development, to scaffold each of these processes in positive ways, it could really alter the trajectory. And so, to me, those are the exciting questions to understand more deeply how these interactions occur, not just mechanistically to understand, but practically, how does this play out in young people's lives, vulnerabilities, and then how insufficient sleep or emotional disruptions can start these cycles of interaction in ways that can be, spiraling down or then, with intervention, scaffolded to go up in healthy ways.
So do you think that this bidirectional relationship applies equivalently across both positively and negatively valenced emotion states with sleep?
So it's a good question, and I think I have a few comments about that. I think, first of all, I think it's an empirical question. At the current state of the science, I think there's strong evidence for negative spiraling components for both aspects of negative emotion and positive emotions, that there's an increased vulnerability reward sensitivity. In fact, some of the work I've been doing with Matt Walker here, we're trying to pull that work down into adolescence, and we're beginning to look at that. And I think that can set off the sort of risk-taking, excitement-seeking dimension, and some of this is relevant to bipolar disorder. But I think that there's also very strong evidence for aspects of negative emotion and how insufficient sleep makes it more difficult to deal functionally with some aspects of negative emotion. But then I also have to say that my personal bias is that I don't like lumping emotions into these two categories as if positive, negative. And I know even the people that do that understand the nuances. But increasingly, I've been interested in the idea that the emotion-specific differences in what emotions people like to feel or don't want to feel, or behaviorally seem to amplify or avoid, can be so different. And I think that even using the language of what are positive emotions and what are negative emotions can obfuscate some really important questions. And to come back to your initial question, I think we may be better off served in understanding how sleep and emotion-specific regulatory processes interact. And it may be there are similarities across any domain of emotional activation or arousal. There could be commonalities, but there also could be specific types of interactions, for example, with fear and vigilance or certain kinds of reward seeking that may not apply to other emotions, even if they're broadly negative or positive. So I think these are really important questions empirically to get in and disentangle in more specific ways.
Right, and as you're saying, it's complex, right? And there's so many open questions, right, as to how this bidirectional relationship works with different kinds of emotional experiences.
The other thing I would say, and it's an important framework for my approach to these questions, is the idea of looking for windows of brain development, windows of social and emotional development, wherein these patterns of interactions may set up particular vulnerabilities for particular youth and particular environments. And I think that's another place where emotion-specific or even positive emotion or negative emotion-specific interactions with sleep could be really important. You have patterns of learning. And we've been interested, for example, in the onset of puberty as a time of fundamental shifts in both sleep and fundamental shifts in some aspects of emotion, some of it positive emotion, reward seeking and sensation seeking, but also sensitivity to social threat and negative emotions and vigilance. And I think that the emotional learning and the role of sleep in learning, including emotional learning, could be just as important as what the short-term effects are on these systems.
What do you think, when you think about these developmental trajectories, to what extent do you think these relationships bear similarities during adolescence as compared to middle or older adulthood?
So I think there are two frameworks within which I think about these things. I think in many ways there are continuities, and this is sort of a deep theme of development, that there are continuities and discontinuities. I think in some ways there are similarities in how these systems work and how learning occurs and how regulatory systems interact in young children, school-age children, adolescents, adults. And I think that there's a lot of value in understanding the commonalities. I think that in addition to that, just like any other measure of growth or development, there are what I call inflection points. And I think the important issue about inflection points in a trajectory is that there's a relatively larger impact of learning and experience. And so one or two or three bad experiences at a key window of time may have a bigger impact on the trajectory. And that's the kind of model, not that it's categorically different, but there are unique opportunities for positive early intervention and unique vulnerabilities that the same sort of hit or challenge or stress to the system, and especially if there are a few of them in a sort of relatively unstable or changing transition, can have a bigger impact. And so rather than just talk about a broad group like teenagers, I think we should understand developmental processes. And some of the developmental processes are social. When you graduate from high school and start college or trade school, you get your first job, but some of them are biologic. And puberty happens to be a biologic transition that is powerfully impacting a subset of these neural systems. And I think that sets up a potential imbalance because there's new change in sensitivity in some of these neural systems, but not others. And puberty's been happening earlier in contemporary society. And the social challenges of young children in middle school is increasingly complex. So I think there are opportunities to understand these inflection points, even if there are similarities to what happens in older adults, middle-aged adults, transition to old age, other inflection points. I think there are reasons to zoom in on the unique opportunities in these early windows of development.
I mean, speaking of this early window of development, it makes me think about, this really novel neurodevelopmental model that you've proposed to try to understand emotion regulation in adolescence, this sort of peak time of discovery from a scientific perspective. And I've heard you speak about it as this time of all gas and no brakes. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what this expression connotes in terms of the unique role of emotion processes during this critical developmental phase.
So I'm actually glad you asked that way because
Yeah.
I think there's some nuances to the metaphor and the variations in the metaphor that are really important. And we actually just published a paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience last year where we did a meta-analysis and revisited some aspects of this. So let me zoom in on this idea of the accelerator and the brake. I actually think that a better metaphor, the initial metaphor was starting the turbocharged engines without a skilled driver. And then Larry Steinberg emphasized the gas and the brakes. But I think the metaphor has limitations. Yes, there is this capacity for acceleration, reward seeking, sensation seeking that seems to kick in. Individual differences. Some kids still are shy and cautious when they hit puberty, but the tendency to engage novel, exciting, ambiguous environments seems to increase at puberty. And that can clearly overwhelm the capacity to be driving carefully or putting the brakes on appropriately. But I think we shouldn't overstate that metaphor, because when adolescents are highly motivated to do a complex task, including a task that requires a lot of inhibitory control, cognitive control, tedious tasks like text messaging, if they're motivated, they can recruit frontal cortex pretty effectively. And in fact, in some situations, they may outperform adults. And so I think the variability in the recruitment of these control systems and the degree to which they learn this quickly varies so much on social context. And I think the metaphor is still relevant because the capacity for these excitement-seeking systems to tip the balance and overwhelm inhibitory control, the ability to put on the brakes or to steer carefully is relevant to understanding what can happen to really smart adolescents who can make good decisions. But I don't think we should imply they're incapable of the steering and brakes part of the metaphor. They can. It's just they're vulnerable to zooming in on the relevance of the social rewards and that tipping the balance. And I think that sleep deprivation or insufficient sleep can amplify that imbalance. The emotional or the affective signals relative to the pausing, cautiously evaluating for a moment before acting is probably tipped a bit more. And I think that's part of the initial thing we were discussing about the synergy, the negative synergy or negative spiral, that sleep deprivation on top of someone who's already a sensation-seeking type of personality in an environment that's very, very excitement-seeking and has a lot of risks, and then add on to that staying up really late, getting up early for school, and being sleep-deprived, those can add up for risk factors and contribute to some of these impulsive, sensation-seeking, dangerous activities.
So, I mean, this is all really interesting, and I like the caveat you put that it's not that they don't have the capacity for the brakes. It's just there's contextual factors, motivational factors that influence when and how they put on the brakes, right? Yeah. It makes me wonder sort of what unique treatment implications might this have for adolescents in managing their emotions and, thinking about the intervening role of sleep, too, in that process.
So that's a great question. So I think I'm going to oversimplify some complex things to sort of zoom in on my intuitions in this area. I think one of the principles that's emerging is that having goals be socially salient to that individual. And again, it's the heart of and the art of motivational interviewing as an approach of where the techniques that are used with adolescents to really ground the motivation for change in something that's relevant and salient to that individual's own ambiguous feelings and what's salient. And having that be socially salient to adolescents is a powerful way to activate these more natural motivations. Something that's abstract and cognitive, that something could happen to you, abstractly, theoretically, in some future time, is not as salient. It doesn't get into the affective, emotional domain and compete as effectively in the moment, in the charged moment. And so I think there are two themes to that. One is having young people do the thinking and planning early in the process, anticipating that they're going to get into a situation with more emotional charge and not easily be able to pause and think and reflect. That's one part of it. And the second thing is to have the motivation to do that be linked to these emotionally salient, socially salient goals or fears or worries. I think those anchoring the change, the reason to change these. So just telling someone to go to bed earlier so that they can get better grades or study more or interact with less irritability in their relationships could be done in a way that taps salience for an individual adolescent, but it also can be done in a way that's like, okay, here's another adult giving me advice about what I should do. And when it's 11 o'clock at night and a friend is texting them about something exciting that's going on, it's just not going to compete. So I think grounding these in ways that are socially and affectively salient goals, and then helping adolescents, align their own individual motivations in those ways are important parts of intervention approaches.
Thank you so much. So the last question I wanted to ask you, we've spoken a little bit about this, is just trying to understand the role of these different emotion-related systems and the sort of development or etiology of psychopathology among adolescents in particular. And I wonder from your perspective what you might consider to be some of the most important developmental trajectories here, whereby emotion might play an influence in the onset of mood disorders like depression, some of the things you've studied in your own work.
So I'm going to dive into the line of question that I find most compelling right now.
Sure.
And it's relevant to what you ask in terms of the trajectory to affective disorders, but I think it's actually relevant to a broader set of health relevant issues in adolescence. And that is that I think affective science generally and affective neuroscience generally, particularly as it's focused on adolescence and on these disorders, has focused almost exclusively on emotions and emotion regulation. And I think the affective dimension of motivation is relatively understudied. And what I mean by that is there's aspects of motivation that are linked to goals and cognitive processes, but a key part of motivation is the feeling of desire, the feeling of value, the fast automatic processing that something has salience. And motivational learning in this affective domain is, I think, part of the window of unique opportunity in adolescence. I think the brain expects new motivational learning to occur about what really is salient to your goals as an individual. You're becoming an individual in a complex society, and the feeling of what has meaning, purpose, value, connects to your passions. These are key windows of learning that create fast automatic prioritizations about motivations. Not that you make yourself do something you don't want to do, but falling in love with literature or dance or changing the world or a particular activity that becomes so strong, you don't make yourself do it. Someone would have to prevent you from doing it because you've in essence fallen in love with a particular kind of activity. And that's sort of the extreme end of this spectrum, but I think there's a dimension of motivational learning that is, I think, extremely important. Depression is a bit of a paradox. In many ways, what happens with depression is a loss of certain kinds of motivation, especially this affective dimension, this pull toward social rewards and wanting engagement. They can make themselves do it to some degree, but it's not as naturally motivated. And I think this inflection points where some motivations can fiercely attach to very unhealthy things like drugs and alcohol, risk-taking, sensation-seeking. Some can really disengage, lose motivation as another part of the inflection point. And then finally, healthy versions of these passions, a mastery curve of channeling your goals and these feelings of motivation in ways that are really leading to productive engagement. And I'm oversimplifying some very complex issues, but I think just as affective neuroscience has brought a new way of thinking about emotions and emotion regulation, I think there's exciting opportunities to understand motivation and motivational learning and the role of feelings in motivations, and particularly in this interval of adolescence.
That's just really wonderful and really interesting. And it makes me think, you've illuminated a lot of complex issues in this field. Where do you see the future of this work headed? What are some of the most critical next steps?
So I'm going to focus a bit in these comments on process. And having worked in this area for more years than I want to admit at this point, I think the most important issue is creating teams of people, teams of researchers who can tackle the complexity, especially developmentally. These are really complicated issues. If you try to reduce emotion or motivation too narrowly to a laboratory task or an imaging study or a controlled experiment, or if you just sample in ways you can look in natural environments in real ecologically valid ways, to do cross-sectional studies versus longitudinal, to really understand the nuances of the social dimension, the affective dimension, peer interactions, and emotions really requires teams of people who can slice through the complexity with well-designed studies, sample appropriately in the diversity of things that can influence these issues. Think about the context, as you mentioned, how important context is for activating different kinds of emotions and motivations, and follow them longitudinally to understand development and trajectory. No one or two labs can do those things well. And so I think one of the challenges, especially for young people who are told they've got to super specialize in one area and become experts, is how to do team science, how to learn to have pockets of expertise, but engage in these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams that I think are really going to tackle the next level of integration and work across these levels, especially for things as complicated as emotion and motivation.
So related then, what kind of advice would you give students who are just thinking about embarking in this field?
So it's hard to give, I mean, I think it can be quite different for different kinds of students, but I think the idea of balancing the yin-yang of, on one hand, zooming in and getting expertise and developing the specialization that's required to do science well, but on the other hand, balancing that with breadth and having co-mentors or spending some time with interdisciplinary teams, because I think increasingly the high-impact, socially and clinically relevant questions are going to require these teams. And if people spend all of the formative years in their development professionally, doing individualized work, they're not going to develop the skills and ways of thinking to really integrate and do these collaborative. Not everybody can do collaborative work, and we still need the brilliant individual who really pushes knowledge forward in their niche. But I also think we need more young scientists who are going to do these cross-disciplinary approaches and integrate in really creative ways across these different levels.
Well, thank you so much for speaking today. It was really wonderful to hear your insights in this field and realize just how complex the issues are and how much we need these interdisciplinary teams to move these important questions forward.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to hearing other people in this series comments on these really interesting issues. And it's an exciting. I think the other thing I want to say, it's such an exciting time in this field. There's so much new knowledge and opportunity. So the more young, bright people we can get into the field thinking about these things and helping us understand them, the better.
Great. So thank you so much. So this concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Ronald Dahl from the University of California at Berkeley. Thanks again.